Hello, this is Teresa McDowell with Disability Categories, Identification, and Special Education Resources. To determine eligibility, there needs to be first an initial evaluation, and in this evaluation, you're going to include a variety of assessment tools and different strategies. They're going to be gathering relevant information about the child's functional, developmental, and academic abilities. The parents can provide information, and that definitely helps determine the content of the IEP. There are two methods of evaluation. The first one is the child's response to scientific research-based intervention, and then the second one is observing a pattern of strengths and weaknesses over time. The evaluation team must ensure that the child meets the definition of one of the categories of the exceptionality, and then, just as important, as a result of the exceptionality, special education is needed. Different categories of exceptionalities. First one is autism. Autism is defined as a developmental disability that significantly affects verbal and nonverbal communication, as well as social interactions. It's usually evident before the age of 3, and it adversely affects the child's educational performance. Characteristics often associated with autism would be repetitive activities, stereotype movements, resistance to changes in the environment, or resistance to changes in the daily routine. And this child may also have unusual responses to sensory experiences. The second category is developmental delay for age 9 and under. A developmental delay means there's such a change from the average development in one or more of the different categories, and the categories would be physical development, cognitive development, adaptive behavior, communication, and social emotional development. The next category is emotional disturbances. Emotional disturbance is a condition where the child exhibits one or more of the following characteristics over a long period of time and to such a degree that their educational performance is adversely affected. The characteristics include the inability to learn that isn't explained with intellectual, sensory, or health factors, an inability to build or maintain relationships with teachers and peers, inappropriate types of behavior or feelings under normal situations, a general pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression, a tendency to develop physical symptoms or fears that are associated with personal or school problems. The next category is gifted. Gifted is referring to performing or demonstrating the potential for performing at significantly higher levels of accomplishment in one or more of the academic fields due to an intellectual ability as compared to working hard at something. And this is when compared to other children of the same age, experiences, and environment. The next category is intellectual disability. Intellectual disability refers to being significantly below average in general intellectual functioning, and it exists concurrently with deficits in adaptive behavior, and it's exhibited during periods of the development, and it adversely affects the child's educational performance. The next category is specific learning disability, and this refers to a disorder where one of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or using language, whether it be spoken or written, may manifest itself in the imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations. It can also include perceptual difficulties, brain injury, minimum brain dysfunction, dyslexia. It does not refer to visual, hearing, motor disabilities, intellectual disability, emotional disturbances, or environmental, cultural, or economic disadvantage. Dyslexia is a form of specific learning disabilities. The next category is multiple disabilities. And with multiple disabilities, we see it as a combination, a combination of disabilities, and they cause such severe educational needs that they can't be accommodated in the special education program by just listing one of the impairments. It is important to realize with multiple disabilities, it does not include deaf blindness. The next category is orthopedic impairment. Orthopedic impairment means a severe orthopedic impairment that does negatively affect a child's educational performance. It can include any of the following: a congenital anomaly, such as a club foot or the absence of a limb. It can include diseases, such as polio. It can include other causes like cerebral palsy or amputation, or fractures or burns that cause contractures. The next category is other health impairments. Other health impairment means having limited strength, vitality, or alertness, including a heightened alertness to the environmental stimuli that results in limited alertness in the educational environment in the classroom. It needs to meet the following criteria: that it's due to a chronic or acute health problem, and it may be from asthma, attention deficit disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, diabetes, epilepsy, a heart condition, hemophilia, lead poisoning, leukemia, nephritis, rheumatic fever, sickle cell anemia, and even Tourette's syndrome. With all of these different disease processes, it's important to remember that this situation has to adversely affect the child's educational performance to qualify for special education services. The next category is sensory impairments. Sensory impairment may be a hearing impairment, and that would be when the hearing, whether it's a permanent or fluctuating situation, adversely affects the child's educational performance, but it does not constitute deafness. It can include deafness, which means the hearing loss is so severe that it impairs the child's ability to process linguistic or language information through hearing, with or without amplification, and it adversely affects the education. It can include visual impairment, that even with correction, it adversely affects the child's education. It can include both partial sight or blindness. The next part of that would be blindness, which is a visual impairment that requires dependence on tactile and auditory media for the child to learn. And finally, deaf blindness, which means there's a combination of hearing and visual impairments that causes a severe communication and or developmental and educational need that can't be accommodated in special education programs solely for either hearing or visually impaired. The next category is the subcategory of the sensory: hearing impairment and deafness. Hearing impairment and deafness is indicated by the following: a chronic or a progressive condition which affects learning, a congenital malformation, or hearing loss that's not severe enough to constitute deafness. The hearing loss does impact the ability to process linguistic information through hearing, and the congenital malformation also could do this. The next subcategory of sensory is blindness or visual impairment. And indicators for this would be a visual impairment that requires dependence on tactile or auditory media for learning, or a chronic condition exists that interferes with the visual learning mode, or it could be ocular motor deficit, the muscle imbalance so the eyes don't work together, and it could be any other vision condition that even with correction adversely affects the child's learning performance. Deaf blindness impairment is another subcategory of sensory. and it is indicated by a chronic or progressive condition that exists with interferences in the auditory learning mode, permanent or fluctuating. Could be congenital malformations, and it does not constitute deafness, though. It may not constitute deafness. It could be hearing impairment that's so severe that it impairs the child's ability to process linguistic information. The next category is speech or language impairment. Speech or language impairment means that there is a communication disorder. It may include stuttering. It may include impaired articulation. It could be a language impairment or a voice impairment, and again, they adversely affect the child's educational performance. The next category is TBI, or traumatic brain injury. Traumatic brain injury means it is an acquired injury to the brain, and it's caused by an external physical force that has resulted in total or partial functional disability or a psychosocial impairment, or could be both. And again, they adversely affect the educational performance of the student. It can be an open or a closed head injury that result in the impairments, and it could affect any of the following areas. It could impact cognition, language, memory, attention, reasoning, abstract thinking, judgment, problem solving, sensory, perceptual, and motor abilities, psychosocial behavior, physical function, information processing, and speech. It is important to remember that this term, traumatic brain injury, does not apply to brain injuries that are congenital or degenerative or that were induced by a birth trauma. The final category is actually not an exceptionality, but it is that of the English language learner, and they're often found in conjunction with another exceptionality. So we need to be aware of that we very well could be working with an English language learner or ELL student in the special education departments. And here's my references. Thank you very much.